We couldn't think of a better person to do this than Raimo Vuorinen from University of Jyväskylä in Finland. And in his current role, where he really heads up the European Lifelong Guidance Policy Network, which is the countries of Europe working together to try to collaborate to develop policy that benefits all of Europe. If you can't kind of think of how different the countries of Europe are, well, the United States is really different. States vary in terms of their economies and the population makeup. Well, in Europe, the differences are even more stark and even more dramatic. So how can we learn from what's happening in Europe and apply that to the United States? So the hope for Raimo's presentation really is that it'll really get us thinking about how we organize ourselves with regard to policy. How can we benefit from the rich diversity of differences among states in the United States to be able to create a better system for all of us? So Raimo was an easy selection in this. He's a frequent speaker. He's worked in all levels of education, from elementary school through secondary school, into higher education, into community colleges, polytechnics, has taught in counselor preparation programs. He's a good researcher, fusing policy with practice, and has done a lot of work in the area of information technology. So it's my great pleasure to have Raimo come to the podium and present.
Before I start, I would like to thank SVP for inviting me to this conference. Just a second. Here we go. I would like to thank SVP for the invitation for this conference and also the opportunity to visit Boston. And yesterday I had the opportunity to go the Freedom Trail and also see the house of Frank Parson. So in a way it was an opportunity to see the long tradition what you have in the United States in the career development. And also there was a cultural experience on the night before. There was a football match in the Boston College Stadium, and the football is quite different what we play in Europe. So thank you for this opportunity to learn also the cultural experiences. And what I was asked to tell about the processes and the structure of the European Lifelong Guidance Policy Network, which we have been establishing during the last 10 years. And in fact, this is a journey. Within the presentation, during these 40 minutes, I will describe briefly how guidance is integrated within the European Union and what is the policy structure and what is the decision-making structure within the Union. And then as I tell the story, in a way it was a happenstance a few years ago when we had the opportunity to establish a structured way for cooperation between the European Union member states. And then I briefly go on to the structure and the working methods, what we are using at the moment, and then some future steps, what we are aiming towards the Europe 2020, which was a strategy adopted about 1 year ago. And then finally, at the end of the presentation, I will highlight some of the sort of potential options of the parallel processes which could be perhaps applied within the context of the United States. And I'm using the word lifelong guidance on purpose because we created the definition of lifelong guidance, which is like an umbrella concept which hosts different activities and helps the cooperation within the countries, but also between the different professional organizations. And to start, during the last 10 years, there has been a sort of advent for lifelong guidance policy development globally. And it is an outcome of a set of evaluations that have taken place under different organizations. In 1998, the OECDs started an activity which was focusing the process from transition to education, from education to work in different countries. And one of the outcomes of this evaluation was that the transition phase was longer than before. And one of the findings was also that one mechanism to promote a more sort of faster and smoother transition would be guidance services. And based on that, the countries were invited to evaluate their sort of current challenges in education and labor market policies and also in social policies. And then the countries also evaluated how they are meeting these challenges within education and also public employment services. Countries were asked how they fund these services and how the services are provided and what is the evidence the countries are using when they are forming these policies. And based on these outcomes, there was a group of interested countries who started to develop a sort of working method which we call International Symposium for Career Development and Public Policies. And now we are having a 6th symposium in Hungary at the beginning of December. So this process is global, and there's consensus that guidance and counseling are seen a key strategic component when we are promoting the education and labor market policies. And also within the United States, you have been participating in these symposiums, and during the previous years, there have been a number of conferences which have had guidance, policy, and advocacy as one theme of the conferences, together with the IAVG as well. And what I will be now describing is sort of a evolution of the European Lifelong Guidance Policy Network, which is a sort of a structured way how the European Union member states are developing their own national policies through structured cooperation. And we are aware that the countries are different if we think of their culture, economic and political situation. Some countries are centralized and some countries are very decentralized. So they are organizing the services in very different ways. And one way of supporting this cooperation is looking for common reference points which the countries can use in mutual policy learning. And that's what we have been doing, and the evolution of the network is an example of this type of a bottom-up approach in developing this structured cooperation. And first, what is European Union? Jim mentioned already that it's a sort of structure which is not a federal structure, but it's a way how this political system that has been evolving during the last 50 years and established different mechanisms to support the development within the member states. And the structure is very interesting because it has different levels of decision-making mechanisms. And I highlight, excuse me, I highlight that we have 3 main decision-making triangles. First, the sort of most important is the Council of European Union. So the prime ministers and different government sectors organize ministerial meetings, which is the main decision-making body and creates the strategies which the sort of supports the overall union. And then we have the parliament, which is the decides the legislation, and some of them are binding and covering different sectors. And then the implementing body is the European Commission, which is located in Brussels, and it sort of represents the common interest of the European Union and has different sort of bodies which are working in sectoral policy areas. And the European Commission also hosts learning programs or funding mechanisms in these sectors, which helps the countries to implement their policies, but also the EU is using these programs to support the mutual learning and common structures between the member states. And one important method for working is the so-called open method of coordination. And this is used especially in education, labor market policies, and in social policies. And it's a framework which allows the diversity between or within the member states. but has sort of common objectives. And the open method of coordination has three sort of main principles. The countries agree on certain objectives which they want to achieve in the light of the main European Union strategies. And then the countries also agree on certain measuring instruments, what indicators are used to measure the progress and the sort of benchmarks between the different countries. And within the education, there are some benchmarks, for example, what is the percentage of early school leaving, and what is the percentage of adults in continuing education, and so on. And then these benchmarks allow the performance of the countries between themselves, but the goal is not to harmonize. The tools are used, as I mentioned, as common reference points which countries can use in accordance to their own priorities. And the European Union is using these funding mechanisms, as I mentioned, to support the national development. And the budget comes from the contribution of all the European Union member states. So in a way, some of the areas are more binding, but as I mentioned, in education and labour market policies, the countries have the autonomy to design their sort of systems. And now I come to the role of guidance within these policies. In the year 2000, the prime ministers of the European Union met in Lisbon, and they had a meeting which concluded to a very ambitious strategy. It is called so-called Lisbon Strategy, and they said that by the year 2010, Europe should be the most competitive knowledge-based society in the world, which is focusing on sustainable growth with more and better jobs and greater social cohesion. It was very ambitious, and now we are in 2011, and we know that this didn't take place. But it was a goal, a strategic goal. And there were then documents in different sectors which were specifying some tools to reach these goals. And at that time, European Union and some of the OECD countries were facing the aging population and labor shortage during the high economy. And there was a need to upgrade the skills of adults who are working, and especially adults. And that was the sort of rationale why the Commission and the Council agreed that lifelong learning would be one key measure to reach these goals and support the development of educational structures within Europe, mobility of students in different sectors, and also the portability of qualification between the member states. And at the time, the Commission launched a communication on lifelong learning, which is a key document which was sort of directing the development of education and policies in Europe. And one of the key points or bullet points in the document was the role of lifelong guidance and giving the opportunities for citizens to utilize the existing learning opportunities. And within the document, there was also a proposal that the European Union member state should establish a sustainable forum for lifelong guidance issues. But at that time, it was not possible because some of the countries were resisting of the establishment of the forum at that time. But that was sort of a first time when guidance was included within one of the policy documents. The next step after this was the including guidance issues to some key documents, other documents which were dealing with education. For example, the aim was to develop a three-year program for vocational education and training as a sort of one way how the citizens could sort of identify their existing skills, and the competencies were described in Europass, which would be used could be used if I would be working in other union member states. And there were sort of a number of tools which had reference to guidance, but it was not a consistent strategy yet. So the Commission invited representatives from different ministers, different stakeholders, employers, trade unions, consumer organizations, youth organizations, and some universities or research institute into a lifelong guidance expert group. And this expert group was like a transversal group representing different interest groups, and it was working 5 years, and it was following how guidance was described in these documents, and also it was using now the findings of the international evaluations which were taking place at the same time in OECD countries, in some developing economies through World Bank, and then the European Union was using the same framework in its member states. European Training Foundation was using the framework in some of the accessing countries and also in the European Union neighboring countries. And we had data from around 50 countries, how guidance was integrated in the policies, and there were some key priorities that the countries should focus on. So the expert group was working together with the Commission and with Ireland, which was at that time hosting the rotating presidency within the European Union. And under the Irish presidency, the Ministers of Education signed first a document on policies which was covering lifelong guidance in all of the European Union member states. And the resolution took into account some of the findings in the evaluation, and then they made invitations to member states how to improve their existing guidance systems. And within the resolution, there was also a common definition for lifelong guidance, because one of the tasks for the expert group was to create a common definitions on lifelong guidance which the countries could agree on, that this is something we would like to work together with. And this resolution 2004, which was a very key, important document for the countries, and as I mentioned, it invited the countries to develop systems for individual career development skills, to widen access to guidance services, to promote cooperation between government sectors on national level, regional level, and institutional level, and finally look for better evidence for national policy making. And these were in invitation to the countries, and then the Commission agreed that they would provide or allocate funding for this type of development. And in order to sort of work together, we created this definition of lifelong guidance. We were aware that we could organize many conferences with the focus, what is guidance? And we could work many days, and we would have different approaches to this issue, which are correct. But the discussion was very often supplier-driven. How do we see this issue from our perspective? And being aware of this challenge, which is already in English language, we have guidance, counseling, tutoring, mentoring, supervising, coaching, which are similar processes. Different languages have different meaning. In German language, it's Beratung, giving advice. In French, Orientation, orientate yourself. In Swedish, Vägledning, show the way to somebody. Or handledning, take somebody by the hand. Or in Estonia, Karjan nostaminen, I give you something in a cup. And in my own language, Finnish, the same word is used for driving the car. So we have to think what is included under this common definition. And we agreed that one way of doing this is to list some activities which contribute to a common goal. And then we said that these could be information giving, advice, counseling, assessment, teaching, advocacy, and so on. And they are targeted for all citizens, not only those who have problems, but also as a mainstream proactive service, how to develop the skills which the individual citizens could use when they are identifying learning goals for their future and how they improve their own employability skills or competencies. So in a way, it has this dimension that at any age and point in their lives. And the focus would not make only choice, but empowerment to manage one's career from lifelong learning perspective. And the career is then described as an individual life path in learning and work and in other settings where these competencies are learned and or used. And there are some documents which are mentioning that from testing to tasting. So in a way, giving the opportunities for the individual to examine different options and then make these shifts from education to work, from work back to education and continuing education, work-based learning and so on. So this umbrella or definition hosts different activities which contribute to the same goal. And it allows then different professional groups to identify that this is the way how I can contribute to this overall objective. And this helps us to look beyond the individual or the work of the individual practitioner to look for what should be the outcome of guidance services and how does it contribute to the education labour market system, but also the social development of the member countries. And this was agreed as a basis what we could work on. And then it was defined in more clearly under the French presidency 2008. It lists the same 4 priorities: career management skills, access, quality assurance, and cooperation and coordination. And this final comment is very important, that it invites the member states to use the opportunities which are provided under the lifelong learning program, which is the funding mechanisms for lifelong learning. It allocates money for development projects, research, and the mobility of students and staff members within different sectors. And also to use the European structural funds in accordance to member states' own priorities. So this was the invitation, and we didn't have any mechanisms to follow up what is happening in the countries. So 2004 or 5, we were discussing within the expert group that what would be the mechanism to follow up how countries are meeting the challenges, because we are having this autonomy in accordance to the open method of coordination. So the expert group initiated a discussion with the Finnish presidency 2006 that we would send a brief survey to the countries how they are meeting the challenges in 4 these priorities and organize a meeting where the different countries could discuss on the topic. And we then made a summary of these findings together with Ronald Sultana from Malta University, and he wrote the summary, and the conclusions was that much had been done, but there was not enough cooperation between the member states. And within this first European Lifelong Guidance Policy Conference in the autumn 2006, there was a group of or teams from different countries, from the Ministers of Labour and Ministers of Education, those who were in charge of guidance policy development in their countries. And they agreed that one way to go forward would be more structured cooperation between the member states. So it was an initiative from the member states who were aware that we are facing similar challenges. What Jim was mentioning in his presentation, that European Union was facing already some signals of the economic recession. So what the countries agreed was to establish the network, and then the European Commission then informed that if the countries are willing to do it, they would support the development through a grant with a subsidy of 75% of all the expenses, if the countries invest 25%. And then Finland was given the task to establish the network. And then we had 2 meetings in Brussels, again with all the member state representatives. And then these same persons were invited to an inaugural meeting in 2007 in Helsinki. And then we were working 3 days in sort of describing what should be the aims and principles of this type of network. And then we wrote like a third statutes or terms of reference, what we should work towards and how we could use the money or the grant that we were getting from the European Union. And then we established a contract with the Commission in December 2007. But the first task was to identify who we are. And it was a challenge to identify or make phone calls or emails to different ministries, who is the person in charge of guidance policy development in your country. And for some countries, it was the first time when this type of request came outside of their borders. And it was a challenging time as well, because first time we met in a meeting in Amsterdam, it was the first time for some countries that two government representatives were sitting on the same table looking at that. It seems that we are having common interests. But it was a very sort of promising situation, because we found out that we are sharing common challenges, and one way to go forward is to start examining these in more details. But first, we agreed to establish an infrastructure, what are our working methods, and then how we set the priorities for our future work. So that's the why we agreed that the network would be established in 3 steps. First work program, the infrastructure. The second work program, what are the sort of objectives in more details. And now we are having this current third work program. We are producing tools for national policymakers, how to improve the situation. And we agreed on some objectives. How could we support policy development in the countries? By sharing policy issues, gather information from different countries, do some analysis how countries are writing guidance in their legislation or key strategic documents, and then we make like concept papers and policy briefings on these current issues. And then how we are using these common reference points to compare the systems, how we use the outcomes of different projects, but most important, how we support the development of national guidance forums in different countries. And then we agreed to create an overall structure. So at the moment, we are having 29 or 31 countries involved in the process. 2 of them are having like observer status. They are not using the Commission grant. That is the only difference. But from each country, we have a team, a person from Ministers of Education who is in charge of guidance, a person from Ministry of Labour or Social Affairs who is in charge of guidance, and a third non-governmental representative who could be representing a national association or Euroguidance Centre or a research unit which is focusing on policies. And this is the composition of the network. And then we are having European Commission who is giving us the grant. So at the moment we are having something like $1.5 million per year to do the work. But if it sounds big, but if you divide that with 30 countries and a secretary, it means for one country perhaps between $50,000 and $100,000 to attend the meetings and do some of the desk studies which are needed to do the analysis in the work. Then we have a steering group which is represent the rotating presidencies, and then they follow that we are doing this work in a transparent manner. And then we have a coordinating unit in our university at the moment, and we have 3 people who are sort of supporting the management, but also managing the processes which I describe in the forthcoming slides. And then we liaise with other parallel international initiatives like the European Union agencies, CEDEFOP, which is an agency for vocational educational training, European Training Foundation, which is following the development in neighboring countries, the OECD, IAEVG, NCDA, but also the heads of public employment services within the European Union. And then these international organizations, we are sort of following what is happening in other sort of countries in the same topic. And this means that this slide doesn't show up, but we must have like an information flow parallelly among the member states and international organizations, but also within the European Commission's member states and those within those organizations who are providing the services. But I go to the working methods. We have 2 annual plenary meetings which rotate within the presidency countries, and we have about 100 people attending these meetings. And these meetings, they agree on the priorities, what we work on, but they also agree on the principles, on some of the content of some of the documents that we would like to have, how guidance is included within some of the policy documents. So in a way, we agree on the content of policy briefings, and we make inspirations to those bodies who actually who has the mandate to implement these decisions. So we are not policy making body, we are policy developing body. We are inspiring those organizations who has the mandate to do the decisions. But we also reflecting some of the existing documents that what would this mean on a national level and how it could be enhanced. And then on top of that, we have divided our work in thematic activities. We organize peer learning activities under these 4 priorities. We organize field visits, which have a common structure, that we send a questionnaire to the countries and are asking that how are career management skills integrated into your education, in comprehensive level, secondary level, and in higher education and in adult education, for example. And then we make an analysis that this is the way it seems, or these are the different options. Then we go to one country and we examine that in more details and then tease out something, what could other countries learn from this system. So in a way, this is the way we do this discourse flow, bottom-up and top-down approach. And then we also conduct thematic studies on certain topic and organize after every 2 years European Lifelong Guidance Policy conferences. The first one was in Jyväskylä, Lyon, Zaragoza, and in next year we are having a conference in Cyprus where we are planning to make a proposal for the European Union covering the years 2014 and 20. And what are the outcomes or outputs? We have been making reflection notes of the thematic activities, as I mentioned. We have made policy briefings, and then we published an activity report last year which describes how countries are meeting the priorities, and it introduces also some existing examples of sort of implementations of policies in different sectors. And then we also create a database of interesting good policy initiatives or policy documents, and we organize national and international events with ELGPN member contributions. For example, if we have a meeting in one of the member states, we try to organize a national conference with policymakers, different sectors, to showcase the development in the hosting country, but also provide some input or reflections. How does this relate to the European level policy development? So it's a sort of a structured, constant dialogue between the countries. And what we have achieved. First, the network as such, it has turned out to be one example of a member state-driven approach in policy development. As I mentioned, we tease out the development from the countries, how they implement these major strategies, and what can we learn from each other. So in a way, it's an example of a structured cooperation mechanisms and a tool for mutual policy learning. On a member state level, we have achieved an objective that all of the participating countries are having a national cross-ministerial or a forum which has representatives from different ministers, stakeholders, researchers, practitioners, which have a dialogue within the country level. The latest two forums were established in Ireland at the beginning of October and in Sweden at the end of September. And I think this is an outcome that we have been able to establish a forum for national policy dialogue. Then the countries report that they have an understanding of career management skills, or the importance of the individual career management skills in different sectors, and also how new technologies can be used in multi-channeling the services. So in addition to the traditional way of working, there's a shift. In UK, they are using a definition called careering. Like there's a shift from education and training to learning. They are saying that this individual approach to career can be described as shift from career guidance to careering. And it can be done with or without the help of practitioners. So in a way, it sort of gives us a challenge to look beyond what should be the outcome of the services, not only the work of the practitioner, as I mentioned. And then there's a common understanding of the need for stronger evidence base, and which is linked to the quality assurance. So how to identify and how to prove it works. And this is a common challenge, for example, what we have been discussing within the international symposium, and looking for the ways how countries have solved the question. The second area of progress is the finding that this progress can be enhanced if governments and local authorities look for ways how they could cooperate in these sectors. But this requires more structured cooperation between different sectors and researchers and policymakers. And there's a need for a common, sort of jointly agreed, a common conceptual framework. How does lifelong guidance contribute to different policy sectors? And we have found out that guidance has turned out to be an interface of different policy sectors. Educational policies emphasize lifelong learning and also prevention of early school leaving, how you complete your studies, how to progress to another learning, how to promote mobility and the personal growth, and also this individual learning journey. And then the labor market, and this has been like a private good. But then the labor market policies are emphasizing the development of labor force, how to modernize the labor market, how to match skills, how to identify emerging competence areas or labor shortages, how to make active transition to labor market and back to work. So in a way, they have that interest. And then the social policies started to get interested in the topic under the economic crisis, that how to maintain your sort of self-esteem and during the time of crisis, and how you use this time in promoting your employability skills. And this means that these different policy sectors are having same goals, but very often working in silos. But guidance has turned out to be that it's a cross-cutting theme between the areas, and that is one reason why the countries are now establishing this type of forums and looking how these different sort of service providers in different settings and also private providers can help the countries in reaching their sort of jointly agreed policy goals. And I give an example of this reality in Finland. This picture doesn't show very clearly, but it illustrates that we have different government sectors who provide services in education, social sector, and employment. The ministries have national goals, then they organize the services regionally, and then we have practitioners who work with the clients. And in many cases, they work under their own sectors. And sometimes these services are overlapping, but the citizens, they have sort of needs which relate to all these service providers, so we need to sort of an agreed understanding what we want to achieve through these services. And that's why we have sort of learned that we have to look at guidance on a national level on 3 levels. It's like the policy development, then the actual guidance provision, and what is the interface between the clients, and how we serve the clients, having a balance within access, but also a balance with social equity, that we provide the services for those who need in accordance to their needs. So in a way, this has been the learning outcome, that we have to be able to look beyond ourselves. And this is challenging because the part of the policies that's not visible for the users, it's done within the policy bodies, and then the users see only the practitioners and those who provide the services. And the counsellor training has all mostly been focusing on these competencies which relate to the service delivery. And now the practitioners need also a language how they sort of transfer their own activities to the policy outcomes. And this is something we have to create a common understanding and also a new competence for the practitioners to be the awareness of this entity, in addition to this important work that we do from our own perspective. But these policies, development and service provisions are filtered through culture, economic and political situation in each country. They are different. So being aware of the situation, we have to think what are the expected outcomes of guidance in different levels. Then we have to think of the learning outcomes, which we have evidence, and then what is the effectiveness of the educational system and the labor market, and then how we contribute to the social development. So these are the areas when we have to work within the policy development. And that's why the network has agreed to work on all these different levels. So we are not focusing not only the individual guidance process, but how it sort of contributes to the development of the society. And this means that it's important how we use these networks in creation of knowledge and the information flow. And the network has turned out to be that we have to shift from silos and hierarchy to a heterarchy, which is a discourse flow from bottom up and top down. So the network as such is a mechanism that we can follow what is happening among the clients and how does it contribute to the policy development, what evidence we have to prove and produce it works, and then also how these policymakers are taking into account the signals that we provide. And I think this is the one rationale why we have to be actively involved in the policy making as such. And this, as an outcome, as I mentioned, that we need a common, jointly agreed conceptual framework, which is sort of has parallel analogies in different levels, and how we use also the information communication technology in modeling this system and getting data. And these are the sort of very sort of multi-dimensional elements, and it's illustrate that this is something we cannot do alone, or which each of the sectors are not able to do alone. And it means that we need new type of leadership and management both in horizontal and vertical networks. So then we can use these networks in creating this type of structures on the service delivery, but also in implementation and evaluating the policies. I'm repeating part of the items, but these are the sort of examples of the structured way how we are working at the same time. And we have created some meta criteria for the quality assurance of the services, how citizens are involved, what are the practitioner competencies, what are service improvement, how we cover different sectors, and what type of evidence we are using when we are creating the systems. And finally, the outcome, as I mentioned, is the challenge that can we support countries to develop these forums in ministerial level, in regional level, and also how the practitioners are working in multi-professional teams, how they communicate, how they operate together, and how they work together and how they sort of coordinate the activities together. And I think this is the outcome what we have learned during the network, or the necessity of this type of systemic thinking. I went through it quite fast, but to illustrate the different dimensions. And then the implications for our future work is that being aware of the ambitious role of the Strategy 2010, the Council of Ministers agreed that that was too ambitious, but how to sort of improve the function of labor market in Europe, they agreed three priorities: smart growth, sustainable growth, and inclusive growth. And these are priorities which all of them emphasize the competence development of the individuals. And the European Union has then agreed some initiatives, support these strategies, and all of them emphasize the active role of citizens through acquisition of lifelong career management skills, which is a set of competencies which helps me to identify my learning goals to improve my employability. And that's why we have to be actively following how guidance is integrated into these documents which are steering the implementation of the strategies. And lifelong guidance should be as an entitlement of citizens, but also as part of the social contract of the countries, how they serve the citizens, not to sort of have the victim role if we sort of emphasize too much on the individual role within the current labor market situation. So we have to have measures to support the opportunities for this lifelong career management skills. And that's why we have a new strategic goals that currently we are working, having sort of contact points who follow up how guidance is integrated into those documents in schools, vocational education, higher education, adult education, employment and social inclusion, both national and European Union levels, and we are producing tools how we support the development. And one of the goal is to create a common glossary of the key definition or terminology what are needed between the countries, but between the policymakers and practitioners and researchers. And this means that we have to have a matrix. We have the 4 priorities, as I mentioned, how they contribute to the different policy sectors. In education, vet, higher education, adult education, empowerment and social inclusion. And what we plan to produce, we plan to produce, again, reflection notes, what should be taken into account on a national level and in Europe, and how these countries have responded to these priorities, and again, a list of examples of good practice from the national levels, which can be utilized in different or in the other countries. And also our aim is to create a toolkit for national lifelong guidance policy making, which has a database of interesting practices, but also a list of challenges which the countries are facing, and then a list of questions, strategic questions, and also policy options, how these challenges can be met, and also these reference points which the countries can use when they are sort of comparing their lifelong guidance system. So in a way, what we have achieved during the 5 years when we have been working is the structure, who are we, and then what should we work with, and now we are creating tools which the countries can use together with practitioners, researchers, and policymakers. And how does this relate to USA? So far, USA has provided a leadership a number of years in many aspects in these fields, theories and also research. So you have many building blocks with a long tradition. Your team, national teams, has been involved in the international symposia since 1999. But United States did not participate in the OECD activity in evaluating the services. That is one sort of fact, that we don't have as consistent data from the different federal states like what we have in other countries. But you have established a Center for Public Policies and Career Development in Pennsylvania State University, and you have had the policy focus and advocacy as themes in many conferences like this one. So my question is that to what extent you could use this type of similar experience what we were having in Europe with 27 different member states, although we are not a federal state, but you have the structure of federal states which have their own autonomy in some cases, but whether we could sort of extract something which are in common to these states. And could you use the process or the similar type of steps what we were having in Europe as a case study or case studies when you are developing a potential cooperating mechanisms within the United States? And how to start with? If you couldn't not involve all the states, use some active states who are already interested in the topic and who have common interest. Perhaps conduct a similar type of evaluation which took place in many of the smallest countries, and do this perhaps in a national framework, and if you get such support from the federal government. But I think the difference between us and you at the moment was that we had the European Commission who allocated us the basic support for how to do the work. So it was in a way like a happenstance, a momentum. We were lucky to have interested people in the Commission who were interested in this from the wider perspective. We had some countries who were active. We had some policymakers on country level who were active. We had persons like Tony Watts and John McCarthy and Ronald Sultana and Peter Plant who were promoting the discourse from academic perspective. So in a way, it was a sort of a way how to put this together. And if you could have this type of network in the USA, you could provide perhaps input for legislation on a national level or the state level, like we are doing on some countries. For example, France has created their own legislation, Iceland has created their legislation, Croatia is currently using this. So in a way, they are using the examples from other states on a national level, like a peer learning, but I could use also positive peer pressure perspective. And then this type of network with the sort of a structured mechanism could also perhaps establishing rules and implementation of this legislation, which could then help the individual users. And this is important. My colleagues have been saying that why does this matter for individual practitioners or regional providers? If we can create this type of a consensus or understanding or agreement to certain issues, we can get a mandate for resource allocation and also the mandate to implement some issues, or there's a request to provide evidence in meeting these goals. So in a way, this is a bottom-up and top-down goal that can be reached. And if you have opportunity to create a network, a long-term challenge would be to look for synergy between these different organizations to enhance more sustainable and transparent evidence base for global policy development in these issues. Because this is a challenge that has common element in different countries. We have different solutions, different national solutions, but it's important that we are sharing our experiences, because it's an issue or challenge that none of the government sectors or none of the countries can solve on their own. And I think I will conclude on this as a sort of a proposal for sharing the experiences, but also learning from the strong tradition what you are having in your country on the topic. And I hope that we have future forums to share these ideas. And I once more thank for the opportunity to share these experiences, and also thank you for your attention on the topic. Thank you.